Welcome to the broadcast. The clock is ticking down to the opening of next year's World Cup to be hosted in Brazil, followed by the 2016 Summer Olympic Games. Instead, the big news that continues to come out of Brazil is the recent anti-government demonstrations that have taken over the country. Protesters have pressured politicians to pass laws aimed at cutting corruption and improving transportation and education. But Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff's sagging approval ratings continue to plummet. So what's next for her government? America's Now contributing correspondent Stephen Gibbs went to investigate.
Mass protests across this vast country. It's the last thing many would have expected to see from Brazil. Over the last decade, this Latin American giant has established an image abroad as the land of the future, the darling of the developing world. So what's behind this? The protests, the majority of which have in fact been largely peaceful, began as a complaint over the less than 10 US cent rise in the cost of bus tickets. But they've evolved into a movement united by its frustration with Brazil's political class. At its height on June the 20th, in cities across Brazil, including here in Rio, a total of 1 million people were demonstrating.
Why are you guys all here?
Brazil has always been a little passive about politics since, I guess, '94, with the movement of Direct Now. We've never been out to the streets. We've never been complaining, and the politics, they start to utilize that against us. They start to rob us. They start to do a lot of corruption. So we went to the streets to start complaining. It was something nobody expected. So it was amazing. Nobody expected that.
To try to establish a profile of the protesters, one Brazilian polling company took a survey. It found that more than half were under the age of 25. 71% were protesting for the first time, and 77% had a university education. This then is Brazil's Facebook generation, emboldened by the fact that, largely thanks to social media, they've managed to organise protests on this scale. It's a movement without a leadership and with a range of complaints. One of its central messages is that the reality of life in Brazil is no carnival. Lift the mask of this country, they say, and you'll see serious problems, which, despite 10 years of economic growth, the government has failed to fix.
Yeah, if you go to our health system, you go in the hospitals, people laying on the floor because they don't even have a bed. If you go to our education, people don't even know how to spell right, don't even know how to speak right, because they don't have teachers. Teachers get paid 700 reais a month, which is equivalent of $350, while our politicians get paid around $20,000. They're worth 11 million a year, each one of them.
The amount Brazil's politicians are paid, and some steal, certainly has fueled the anger here. In 2010, members of Brazil's Congress awarded themselves a 62% pay rise. They currently earn around $204,000 US a year. That's 27 times Brazil's average salary. By comparison, members of the United States Congress earn $174,000, 5 times the average US salary. In the UK, a Member of Parliament earns $100,000 a year, around 4 times the country's average income. And Brazilians who targeted this country's Congress building at the start of the protests don't feel they're getting their money's worth. Currently, almost 1/3 of all the members of Brazil's Congress are facing criminal charges. And what's worse, punishment is notoriously rare. For much of last year, Brazilians were gripped by a televised trial of dozens of congressmen, including video evidence of cash handouts. 25 were convicted, but all so far have avoided jail.
For years, an entire generation of Brazilians have privately complained about corruption, poor public services and inefficiency. But what happened last month is that in the space of just a few days, that evolved into a social movement. catching almost everyone unawares.
Brasileiras e brasileiros.
That includes the president.
Importantes lições.
Dilma Rousseff has said she agrees with much of what the demonstrators say, but even so, her political future seems now in some doubt. In the space of just 3 weeks, her approval rating has collapsed from 57% in a poll taken just before the first major protests to just 30% in one taken on June the 28th. The president has pledged to improve things, and Congress has acted fast, already agreeing to allocate more money to health and education and tougher sentencing for corruption. But is that going to be enough to stop this? These 3 young Brazilians, like everyone else, have been amazed by what's happening here. But they also have mixed feelings about the way this is going.
Well, when this protest started, I thought it was a little bit confused because they didn't have like a point. But after a while and getting into the protest and everything, I saw that we actually have a chance to make it work.
But is it a bad precedent that every time the people are unhappy here, 1 million people can go out on the street? Isn't that actually potentially quite dangerous for the country?
Well, I don't think so, because the people that are going to the protests are not really going to a fight or something. They are just arguing for something that they believe.
Paulinha, a marketing executive, has not been to the protests. She's worried that protesting about everything could be self-defeating.
I want more education too. I don't like bad politicians too. But I just don't think that the way that the protests are going is a way of very efficient.
It's like open a window. It's like to talk about it. Something that
this window was open since for example, you talk about political reform. We do that every 4 years. We vote every 4 years.
I think that the protest going on in this year, 1 year before the election, something that's really important because the politicians that are there, they're worried about it. They are thinking, they are actually stopping to think that all the Brazilians are blind and they can do whatever they want. I think that a lot of people that next year will actually think about before voting.
Mass popular protests are taking place all over the world in the last few years. Have you been inspired by other global protests?
Yeah, of course. I think it's a system crisis around the world. It's not only Brazil. And we're just making part of this whole thing.
Many have been surprised that Brazil, which has record low unemployment and over the last 10 years has lifted 40 million people out of poverty, has been hit by this wave of global discontent. But the reality is that this is an economy which is currently close to stagnant, and people are questioning the depth of the last decade's economic progress.
We are living in a very trouble situation right now in Brazil because the economic growth is getting slower and lower than the last 10 years. The last 10 years, the Brazilian economy created millions of jobs, 2.1 million jobs per year in the formal labor market, which is progressive and positive. On the other hand, 94% of these jobs pay up to 1,000 reais, so it's very low level of wage. That's the reason, because we have economic growth, but on the other hand, we have a sort of social unrest context, because the people realize that this economic growth, it is not so good for them.
And the final problem, the World Cup. The Brazilian government lobbied hard to win the right to host the football championships next year. It's since spent $12 billion building and refurbishing stadia, relishing the opportunity to show the world that Brazil has arrived. Its leaders would never have imagined that the event would become a symbol for protesters of waste, corruption and misplaced priorities. But this is a country where everything is now being questioned.
Our thanks to Stephen Gibbs for that report.